Today, I will be interviewing two luminaries who live in our midst. They will be educating us on the erosion of our constitutional rights. Welcome to Take Back Our Power. I'm Joy Binah. Daniel Sheehan and Sara Nelson have been relentless advocates for social justice and our constitutional rights. Daniel Sheehan is one of the most well-known and experienced constitutional attorneys in the United States, with an astounding resume that would take the entire show to elaborate on. He has participated in and led legal teams in some of the most important lawsuits in the last 40 years. These lawsuits include overturning impediments to access to birth control while at Harvard Law School, winning at the Supreme Court level the right for a newspaper person to protect their sources in the Pentagon Papers case, which exposed volumes of secret Pentagon information about the Vietnam War, including the fact that we started the war. They did not. Daniel Sheehan worked with F. Lee Bailey on the Watergate lawsuit, significantly contributing to the resignation of Richard Nixon. He represented the ACLU at Wounded Knee in the 70s, after which he served for 10 years as general counsel to the United States Jesuit Headquarters National Office of Social Ministry in Washington, D.C. He then co-founded with the National Organization for Women's Labor Secretary, Sara Nelson, the Christic Institute, from which Attorney Sheehan served as chief counsel in the following federal cases: Karen Silkwood, the 3 Mile Island litigation, the American Sanctuary Movement case, and the Greensboro Civil Rights case. Attorney Sheehan has also served as chief counsel on the Iran-Contra civil case against the Reagan-Bush administration. Daniel Sheehan has taught constitutional law at Harvard, Yale, Notre Dame, and Antioch School of Law in Washington, D.C., and has been teaching a class on the U.S. Constitution at the University of California in Santa Cruz since 2012. The class is very well received by the students and lifelong learners, almost 100 people in the class, and you can view all the classes on YouTube under Daniel Sheehan. Mr. Sheehan is also presently the president and general counsel of the Romero Institute in Santa Cruz, California, a 501c3 public interest law firm and public policy institute that is the progeny of the Christic Institute. He's presently representing the 9 Sioux tribes of South Dakota in their effort to establish their own tribally administered Indian Child and Family Services agencies to stop the seizure and removal of Lakota children from their Indian homes by the state of South Dakota and their involuntary placement in all-white foster care settings. Daniel Sheehan's wife of 37 years, Sara Nelson, is the former National Labor Secretary of the National Organization for Women in Washington, D.C., the former National Executive Director of the Christic Institute in Washington, D.C., the former National Executive Director of Mikhail Gorbachev's State of the World Forum at the Presidio in San Francisco. With 4 decades of experience as the Executive Director of some of our nation's most effective public interest research, public education, grassroots organizing, and law and policy organizations, Sara Nelson is currently the Executive Director of the Romero Institute in Santa Cruz. The Romero Institute was founded in 1980 and is exposing and implementing solutions to structural injustice, human rights, constitutional violations, and serious threats to the environment. The 2 current projects are the Lakota People's Law Project and the Constitution Protection Zone Project, which we will be covering today. And from what I have seen, Sara Nelson is the wind beneath the wings of Daniel Sheehan. Now we have the privilege of meeting Daniel Sheehan and Sara Nelson. Welcome, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to address our community today. It's such a privilege to sit with you, really.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
It's
Thank
our
you for having
privilege
us.
to be here. Thank you.
So, Sara, can you tell us about what the Constitution Protection Zone project is?
Yes, the Constitution Protection Zone is a citizens' action mobilization. It's nonpartisan, it's patriotic, and our focus is to pass an ordinance in the city and county of Santa Cruz that makes the county and city of Santa Cruz a protection zone for the Constitution. And so it's the Constitution Protection Zone project. And there are other counties that are watching this and that are receiving our information and thinking about whether they want to do something similar. We want to start with Santa Cruz. We want other counties to join with us, and then we eventually want the state of California to be a Constitution Protection Zone. Mm-hmm. The reason why we're doing this is that we have had an erosion of our constitutional rights that is very serious. It's happened within the context of a National Defense Authorization Bill. There are two sections in it. This was the bill of 2012, and there are two sections, 1021 and 1022, that take away our right to due process. And due process is our right to have an attorney if we are arrested, our right to know what the charges against us are, our right to make a phone call to our family and let them know where we are, our right to a trial, our right to question our accusers. All of these rights are under due process, and they are very American. We're talking about a fundamental part of who we are. And these two sections of this bill have created a situation where an American citizen could be arrested and not have any of those rights. And in fact, it's interesting, one of the senators, Lindsey Graham, said, when asked about it, he says, when they say, meaning if you're arrested, when they say, I want my lawyer, you tell them, shut up, you don't get a lawyer. So this is kind of like over the top. As American citizens, we have come together because we have to draw the line on what can be done in the name of terrorism and in the wake of 9/11. The laws that are encroaching on our liberties as citizens, we feel we have to push back, and we have to insist that American citizens will have constitutional rights, period. Whether they're guilty, not guilty, they have the rights that we have here under our Constitution.
So Daniel, you're a constitutional attorney. What has happened at the federal level that created this layering in of laws affecting our constitutional rights?
Well, actually, peculiarly enough, it started back in 1990 under George Bush Sr. That when he was notified in June of 1990 that there were indications that the Soviet Union was getting set to voluntarily dissolve, they became panicked that they were going to be losing their kind of ultimate other that was a rationale for massive military spending and huge military budgets and the national security state measures that they had put in since the end of World War II, allegedly to confront world communism, that they were going to lose their ultimate adversary. And so what happened is George H.W. Bush sent a communique to Saddam Hussein in Iraq and informing him that George Bush knew that Saddam was having difficulty with his neighbors, Kuwait, accusing them of slant drilling under the borders of Iraq, taking Iraqi oil. And Bush, in the handwritten memo that he sent to Saddam Hussein via our ambassador to Iraq, April Gillespie, told him that if in fact Saddam Hussein thought it was necessary to resort to the use of military force against Kuwait, that Bush Sr. was not really opposed to that. And so Saddam Hussein sent troops down and mobilized them on the Kuwaiti border, at which point the George H.W. Bush's Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, back in 1990, contacted the ambassador to the United States from Saudi Arabia, Prince Bandar, and invited him to the West Wing and said, oh, look, we've got information indicating that Saddam Hussein is going to be invading Kuwait. Moreover, we have beliefs that he's going to go into Saudi Arabia and attempt to overthrow the House of Saud. And so we want to invoke an old treaty pursuant to which you'll invite us in to protect you. And that's what he did. Now, the whole thing with the back end of it was a lie. They had no such information whatsoever. But when, in fact, Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait, they believed in Saudi Arabia that it was true. And so they invited the United States to come in and occupy the entire Middle Eastern oil fields. And that's what Bush did in the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. Well, that's when it started, that whole assertion. And what happened is when they went in and stayed, and even after they'd pushed Saddam Hussein back up into Iraq, and George Bush Sr. said, oh, we now have to set up a no-fly zone. We're going to have 250,000 U.S. troops permanently based in the Middle Eastern oil fields. Well, what happened is the radical Islamicists, under the direction of people like Osama bin Laden, declared a jihad to drive them out of the Middle East. And they bombed U.S. embassies in Africa. They attacked the USS Cole in Yemen. They attacked the Marine Corps barracks. They did these things trying to push them out of that occupation. Well, what happened is immediately the United States started saying that these people were terrorists because they were attacking U.S. interests and undermining our foreign policy, which was now the occupation of the Middle Eastern oil fields. Well, so that is how it began. And when W. Bush came in, when Bush Jr. came in 2001, he started planning a military invasion of Afghanistan, arguing that the Taliban were harboring Osama bin Laden and the Al Qaeda. That's what the plan was. In fact, W. Bush was getting set to invade Afghanistan in October of 2001, and that word got out. And so what happened is there was a retaliation undertaken by Osama bin Laden and the others to attack the United States, to attack the Pentagon, etc., to try to stop them from doing this attack. Well, in immediate response to that, W. Bush and Dick Cheney, now the vice president, actually mobilized and immediately demanded that the Congress pass an authorization for the use of force against those who were directly involved in staging the attack and anyone who directly aided those people in planning or executing the attack. And so they had that authorization that was passed on the 18th of September, just within the week of the attacks. And under the authority of that general authorization for the use of force, what happened is the Cheney W. Bush administration basically started undertaking all kinds of major illegal surveillance on our telephones, on our computers, on our emails, started setting up all kinds of visual surveillance of people all around the country, and capturing all of our phone calls and all of our emails and all of our communications on our computers, and copying down what sites we went on to and looking on Google and other things, and gathering all this together and then just searching through it wildly and in secret. And when they got caught doing that, when Edward Snowden revealed on WikiLeaks the internal documents showing that they were doing this, then they in fact started insisting that they had the authority to do this under this general authorization for the use of force, and they had passed a Patriot Act, which had given them some limited authority, but nothing of this scale at all, which the courts have now acknowledged it was totally unlawful what they were doing. So what they tried to do is start to go to Congress in taking advantage of the fear that the right-wing Republicans and even some of the Democrats had of being accused of being, quote, soft on terrorism now. Like they used to accuse them of being soft on communism. Now they were soft on their new adversary, these potential terrorists. And so they would go to them piecemeal and start feathering in one statute after another, authorizing what it was that they were already doing that was illegal. And that's what these series of statutes are. The Patriot Act and the National Defense Authorization Act. And the worst of them all came after Obama came into office. The right wing of the Republican Party actually proposed a new radical statute, which was this section 1021 and 1022. And what they authorized them to do is it was authorizing the United States military to arrest American citizens, anybody that they chose to, merely on the grounds that some person in the executive branch, not identified, had a reasonably articulable suspicion that this person might have provided significant assistance, not to the attack, but to any organization that was even associated with anyone who had participated in the attack. So it was like 3 or 4 steps removed, and they never defined what significant or substantial assistance was, and they never didn't restrict themselves to the original authorization to deal with only the people that participated in the attack of 9/11. They had expanded it out now to say any organization or association that has engaged in any hostile activity toward the United States or any of our allies. So what they started doing is they started building these concentric circles way out around the narrow authority that had been given to them under the authorization for the use of force. And they got to the point where when Obama was in office, they insisted upon having the authority to militarily rendition any person, including American citizens, who had so much as given any assistance to anybody who was associated with an organization, not that had been involved in the attack, but that had ever engaged in hostilities against any of our allies. So that you started getting this huge expansion of authority. And even when a number of people brought a federal lawsuit to challenge this as unconstitutional, both unconstitutionally overbroad and chilling on people's rights to oppose the policies of the United States government in occupying the Middle Eastern oil fields, etc., that several people brought an action in the court in New York and demanded to have it declared unconstitutional, saying they were reporters like Chris Hedges, Dan Ellsberg, Naomi Wolf, a series of people who have written, Noam Chomsky, people who were critical of American foreign policy in the Middle East. They said, look, here's what we do. We interview people, we write journals, we do reports in the newspapers, we have blogs on the internet. We're critical of American policy. We may even actually interview people who are involved in some of these organizations. And we want to make certain that that isn't covered. And so the federal judge, Catherine Forrest, the federal district court judge in New York, said, well, this is easy. Let's just have the administration, U.S. attorney, say those things aren't covered. The U.S. attorney said, oh, no, I'm not saying those are not covered. And so she declared it unconstitutional. And right away, the Obama administration appealed it to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and they reversed her, saying, oh, it's not clear that they would be covered, even though the U.S. attorney specifically said he thought they might be covered. And so now they said, oh no, this is constitutional, and so that is the law of the land right now. So what happened is immediately after it was enacted, our Santa Cruz City Council passed a resolution. Don Lane introduced it. It was co-sponsored by two other of our...
Ryan Coonerty.
Co-sponsored, saying that this is unconstitutional, that we want our congressperson to state that it's unconstitutional and try to take steps to get it stopped. That was as far as they went. But within the year, our state assembly the California State Assembly voted 71-1 to make it a criminal offense to try to enforce that statute in the state of California. That any federal official that came into the state of California to try to enforce this was guilty of a criminal act to be put in jail for a year. And any state employee or law enforcement officer or anyone that was employed by the state of California that participated in any way would go to jail for 6 months. So, I mean, it was a very aggressive position that the state assembly took. 71-1 voted to do this. Well, the state Senate backed off and said, look, we'll take just a provision out of this that says it's unconstitutional, and it shall be the policy of the state of California not to allow any of our employees or law enforcement officers to participate in any way in enforcing this. The problem is that it isn't necessary for them to cooperate. That the feds can come in, federal military people can come in and rendition us and take us into custody, and as Sara pointed out, not allow you to notify anybody you've been taken into custody. You don't have any lawyer. You aren't told what the charges are against you. You aren't told what the evidence is against you. You're not allowed, very importantly, you're not allowed to appear in front of a magistrate under the writ of habeas corpus, which is guaranteed in our Constitution, that they have to produce you within 48 hours in front of an independent magistrate to determine whether or not there's probable cause to believe that you've committed a crime. It says that right in the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Okay? But what they did is they said, well, since we're not charging you with a crime, we don't have to bring you in front of any magistrate because we don't even have to have you committed a crime. All we need to do is have a reasonably articulable suspicion that you gave any significant assistance to anyone who is associated with any group or organization that is engaged in hostilities against the U.S. or any of our allies. And so that this is the state of the law right now. And so that we have said, look, we need to go back to our city council that is already on record of saying that this is unconstitutional and say, look, what are you going to do about it? Other than just say, oh, this is unconstitutional. You have a constitutional oath of office that you've taken to protect the Constitution. You're here to guarantee our constitutional rights in our city and in our county. So you have an additional obligation to pass this ordinance, putting some force behind this thing. If we're not going to have the state assembly's position that it's a criminal offense, that you can have your sheriff and your police officers go and arrest anybody who tries to enforce this, you've got to do something more than just say you think it's unconstitutional. And so that we want to have a process established, which the ordinance does, for setting up a process so that if anybody learns that they're attempting to enforce this in our city or in our county, that they need to notify the city council right away, and the city council has to come into session immediately and take all necessary steps to provide due process for this person. We're not saying these people go free. We're not saying that we're going to keep them from being brought before a reasonable court, that we just insist upon them having due process. So they would have to be brought in front of a magistrate and a determination made as to whether or not there was, as the Fourth Amendment says, whether there's any probable cause to believe that this person has committed any crime whatsoever. And if there is no such probable cause, then we need to provide them protective custody from the feds who are attempting to come in and swoop them up and take them to some military prison where they can be subjected to this enhanced interrogation, which we're not going to stand for in Santa Cruz. So that's what the ordinance is all about, and that's the condition of things, one step after another, that led to us having to do this as citizens who believe in our Constitution. In fact, insist upon our Constitution.
So, having had the experience of collecting signatures for the Constitution Protection Zone Committee, I was met with a common response when I was out there in public. And that response was, I'm not a terrorist. How's this going to affect me? Yeah. So what do you have to say to that?
Well, there's two things, because we've encountered that ourselves, that actually their first response is, I don't believe this. This can't be true. Mm-hmm. My government, especially Barack Obama and the administration, the Democratic Party, would never do this. So that you need to be in a setting with them to be able to show it to them and explain it to them, show them the case decision where the U.S. attorney said, yes, this is true, it applies to Americans. So you have to deal with that thing first. So it's a little difficult to just walk up to somebody on the street in like 30 seconds when they're on the way to a civic auditorium or something, because it's complicated. So that we need to go to their houses and knock on their door and say, look, let us show you this, give us a couple minutes to show you what this is, to prove first that it's true. But that is the state of affairs. The second question that they always ask is, well, they'll only enforce this against real terrorists. Okay? Well, that was answered because of the position that was taken in the case with Chris Hedges and the others, where they actually stated that when the judge confronted them as to whether or not simply interviewing somebody from Al-Qaeda or any of the other groups,
Taliban,
or the Taliban or anybody else, and getting their position on these things would be considered aiding and abetting them or assisting them. So that it's quite clear. Now, people might say, well, I'm not even a journalist, but then what you have to do is remind them of what Reverend Niemöller said back in Germany in the 1930s, when the fascist government in Germany started passing statutes like this one after another. In the first, they said, they passed statutes and came after the communists. And so I wasn't a communist, so I didn't do anything about it. Then they passed statutes against the gypsies and took them in, and I wasn't a gypsy, so I didn't do anything about it. Then they came for the Jews, and I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't do anything about it. Then they came for the labor union people. And I wasn't even a labor union person, so I didn't do anything about it. And what Reverend Niemöller said is, then they came for me. And there was nobody left to defend me. So that what you see is this is a process of feathering in one step at a time, going after the people, testing the waters to see how far they can get away with this. In fact, the attorneys for W. Bush and Dick Cheney, David Addington and John Yoo, the guys who drafted up these memos on torturing, they actually wrote a memo talking about how if they roll these things into place, and nobody protests, you can actually take that as a common law assent to this policy going down. And so that we now know they're on record of viewing our passivity in the face of them doing this to other people as a consent for them to continue going after more and more people. So that we need to be able to explain that to our citizens, that it's important for them to understand that not only is this being viewed expansively and being interpreted expansively, but in fact, there is every indication of the fact that they're going to continue to enforce this up the line until they get anybody who basically vociferously opposes their foreign policy. Because they've now amended the statute to not even be confined to the original authority just to go after people who have directly aided those who participated in the 9/11 attack. What they've done is they've said that they're authorized to go after anybody who, in fact, is threatening not only any action against our government, but against our foreign policy. So you can see that there are devious and sharp practicing attorneys functioning for this national security state bureaucracy that are constantly creeping one step by one step into trying to set up a national security state. And that's what people need to understand. So we need to come to the defense of the Constitution.
Sara, would you like to comment on this subject?
Well, yes, I'd like to go back to the case that Chris Hedges, Daniel Ellsberg, Noam Chomsky, that they filed against the NDAA Act. And because, for people who don't remember, Daniel Ellsberg is the person who released the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War. He worked in the administration, and he knew about the volumes of Pentagon Papers that reviewed the history of what had happened in Vietnam. And he realized that Vietnam did not start that war. We did. And yet the people had been told that they shot at our ships and that is what caused this whole thing to begin. And so when the Pentagon Papers were released, there were an enormous amount of information that became available to the American people that clarified for them what the intent and the purpose and the tactics and stuff that were being implemented there. And it was very important. It was very important that we have access to this information. Well, when a person like that, who's a whistleblower, who is acting in the interest of the citizenry so that they can know, they can be educated, know how to decide how to vote, because only an educated citizenry can be a truly democratic voting body. And so when he was part of this lawsuit against the NDAA, and it was concluded legally that the NDAA is constitutional, and they could not say that it would not be applied against a person like Daniel Ellsberg or a person like Chris Hedges, who's been an international journalist for the New York Times in the Middle East and Afghanistan, and they couldn't say that it wouldn't be applied to Noam Chomsky, who's an MIT professor who has written critical books about foreign policy, that was a true, signal to all of us that this could be broadly applied, and it's a slippery slope. I mean, Ben Franklin said that if a people choose security over liberties, if they give up liberties in the interest of security, they will end up with neither. And we know from previous history, our history is not really long, but we know that in fact the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. So this situation that we find ourselves in, where this term terrorism is starting to be used quite broadly. We have clippings in our coalition from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, from the LA Times, from the Chicago papers about the use of this term and these tactics against environmentalists who are being called eco-terrorists. And in Chicago, there's actually a picture of a building, a quite large building that's being used as a detention center where people are being picked up and they may disappear into this detention center for as long as 3 days. No one knows where they are. They're not allowed to call an attorney. Their family doesn't know where they are, and they're being questioned. This is a small example of the larger threat, which is that a person could actually disappear into a military detention center for a very long time, and no one would know where they are. What's happening is that local police are being trained by federal officials from both Homeland Security and now FBI, which was recently exposed in the papers, to help with the war against terrorism. And the problem with this is that this training is encouraging the police to think about the citizenry as the enemy, which is, in other words, the tactics and the mentality that are being used in Afghanistan and Iraq are being imported to us locally, and the police, it encourages them to begin thinking about us as the target and the enemy, and the tactics that are being used in the military process are beginning to be used against the citizens. We need to mobilize. This is our moment in terms of our citizens. This is in history. This is our time to protect the Constitution. And we're not the only ones that have spoken out about this, because these articles in these other news clips, they're all opposing the NDAA. They're all saying, wait a minute, this is not right. This is a real threat to constitutional rights. And as Danny said, the state weighed in, our city weighed in, other people in the country are aware, but it takes mobilization. It takes citizen action to actually push back on something like this. And our group, we have an organization now that meets about every 2 weeks. We have 17 organizations in the coalition. We have a number of endorsers, and we are going for 50 organizations and many, many, many endorsers, and 10,000 signatures on the petitions. Before we're gathering all this together slowly, step by step, before we go to the City Council and before we go to the Board of Supervisors, because we want to be very clear when we get there that this is a broad base of citizens, nonpartisan. We are defending the Constitution. Your oath of office was to defend the Constitution. We want to be very clear that there are penalties and procedures that must be in place to make sure that this happens. And we have in our group a range of people: libertarians, Democrats, Republicans, young people, old people, all ages, because this is probably the most American, patriotic process that anyone could be involved in.
And moreover, that there's an authority that we have as well as citizens to do a ballot initiative. And so that while we're going to give the City Council and the Board of Supervisors the opportunity to demonstrate their exercise of their constitutional responsibility to their oath of office, to take steps to protect our people and our constitutional rights, that we're going to be in parallel moving to get a ballot initiative put on the ballot in November of 2016. When in tandem with the presidential election, that if the City Council and/or the County Board of Supervisors does not agree to do this, we're going to have an initiative, a ballot initiative, to have our people vote on this and compel them to do this. And I don't think that they want to go. They don't want to be shown to have to be forced into abiding by their own oath of office, because if they do that, then people are going to say, "Look, we need to replace you with somebody else." This next election.
Yeah, so please, right now, take the opportunity to go to the website and sign the petition. That's definitely the first step. But as we continue, I'd like you to speak to another response I got out there in the field, and that was the federal government will do whatever they want, and they'll just come in the middle of the night and take whomever they want. And so how is, a Constitution Protection Zone going to stop them from doing what they decide they need to do?
Well, you saw that, for example, when the people in the state of California spoke out with the ballot initiative to establish medical marijuana, there was an initial response on the part of the W. Bush administration and their Attorney General Ashcroft to send in federal authorities to try to defy that, and tried to arrest a few people and tried to prosecute them under the federal statutes against marijuana, despite the fact that the people of California had all spoken, an overwhelming majority of wanting to have the access to medical marijuana. So what happened is the people pushed back against it, and then they backed off. And the reality is now that not only does the federal government not try to come into California to try to prosecute anybody under the federal marijuana laws, but that in fact now, because of that misconduct on the part of the federal administration under W. Bush, that other states went forward and passed the statutes. And so that as long as the citizens are mobilized, as long as we're mobilized, the federal government and the officials understand that we will mobilize and we will take steps to defy them. And now we're doing this all within our constitutional rights, within the democratic processes, and we're going to do that. So if they try to come in to use brute force against our people, then what we do is we go back to the state legislature and say, you remember the Assembly bill that said that it's a criminal offense for any federal officials to come in to try to enforce this? Let's go back to that. And that we're then going to have our state and local police officers in sheriff's departments authorized to arrest you if you try to come in to do this. So that, that we don't want this thing to escalate, but the fact of the matter is they need to know that we as citizens are ready to escalate the activity that we have to engage in to stop this from happening and to protect our constitutional rights, so that they'll know we're serious about it. And we can make clear to David Addington and John Yoo and the other people who have written the memos saying our acquiescence is a common law consent to that. They'll know that there's no consent coming from our citizens.
In these articles about eco-terrorism, about the arrest and of environmentalists who are protesting and taking action to protect the environment in the face of climate change, etc., there's also been the term used, domestic terrorists, against people in the United States who are protesting. And my concern for the future is, in California we have this very serious drought, and we don't know exactly what's coming and how long the drought is going to last and how serious it's going to be. But if people start protesting over the issues relating to water, we could see the term used, water terrorists. And we have to realize that this is sort of an insidious kind of spreading of this term. And so I think it's important that we not only realize that all of us as citizens need to come together to protect our rights, but we in this breadth of this little mobilization that we're doing, we need to be talking with the police and talking with the sheriff's department and working with the law enforcement because they are our protectors. Their job is to protect the citizens. We need to take steps to make sure there's communication, appreciation, mutual understanding of these issues, because we have to also take steps to mitigate and push back against this sort of militarization process that's going on in the country.
And moreover, there's direct evidence now that the information that is being gathered under the rubric of anti-terrorism, all this intelligence data about gathering our phone calls and our emails and our activities on our internet and all that kind of stuff, that they're turning this over to law enforcement people. And they're using it in regular garden variety law enforcement. So that they're basically using it to jump over the hurdles that the Constitution has erected against this kind of mass surveillance and illegal wiretapping and all that kind of stuff that has been in place for 200 years in our country. And they're using that to try to curry favor with the law enforcement people, to get them on board. Say, oh, you've been objecting all of this time but to not getting to get more information to help you do law enforcement, and you do it the easy way. You know, the federal government administration is now offering them this intelligence information. And even though we've had barriers erected against this ever since 1947 with the passage of the National Security Act that created the Central Intelligence Agency and the NSA and everything else, that there were clear provisions in there prohibiting any of this from being used in normal law enforcement, or otherwise the Fourth Amendment would have no meaning whatsoever. And so what they started out by doing is saying, oh, this is only going to be done outside of the country, only going to be done, you know, against foreigners and stuff. And so people allowed that to go on. And now they're starting to see that that comes home to roost, because that type of privilege that was granted to them to ignore these constitutional principles all throughout the world, except for domestically, have now come home, and they're now ignoring them at home. And they're starting to solicit the favors of the law enforcement people by providing all of this information to them. For example, the Homeland Security Department unilaterally grants a huge grant to the city of Santa Cruz to put up license plate readers. They start putting these license plate readers up all around our town, and they're constantly monitoring all the license plates in the city. And they're gathering all that information together on video, because now they have the technology to store all of this digitally. So they can store tens of thousands of hours of these videos. And what they're doing is they're not only photographing the license plates, but also who's in the car, and keeping track of where that car is at any given time. That there's a separate file that is kept as to where that license plate is seen at any given time. So they can actually reconstruct your patterns of who you're going to see, what houses you go to visit, how long you stay there, who else is in the house with you, who's in the car with you. And they're sending all of this information up to a center in San Francisco under the Homeland Security Department. And now what they're doing is they're giving regular law enforcement officers access to that information in their regular law enforcement. And what they'll say is just like, well, why shouldn't we? Because they've never been trained to have the adequate sensitivity to the protection of these rights. Many of the police departments, they've always viewed these as an impediment, but at least they knew they were an impediment. And now that they're figuring out how to get around all of that stuff, so that what we're having is a full-scale national security state in which they're interlocking all of the United States military, the United States Marshal Service, the FBI, the Justice Department, the Bureau of Homeland Security, the military officials now, with the local and state police departments. You know, Ronald Reagan tried to do this when he was governor. He had this readiness exercise that was called Operation Cable Splicer. And it was designed to try to coordinate the law enforcement authorities inside the state of California when he was governor with the United States military. In the event that, catch this, in the event that the anti-Vietnam War demonstrators joined forces with the black nationalists and tried to overthrow the government of the state of California. So you see the kind of the fascist kind of fantasies that some of these people engage in, you know, like Ed Meese and Ronald Reagan and Dick Cheney and their lawyers, David Addington and John Yoo and these people, that these people need to be clear about the fact that fascism is a very real mindset and that it didn't exist just in Germany. You know, that there were fascists here in the United States. J. Edgar Hoover was doing this kind of surveillance against people all the time, intimidated congressmen and senators for decades by doing this illegal surveillance against them. That this thing is that we cannot allow this thing to move any farther. We need to stop it now. We need to nip it in the bud. You know, just like the White Rose group that arose in Germany in the 1930s that were trying to warn everybody about not allowing these statutes one after another to be passed by the German government because it would eventually dissolve all the rights of the German people. And that's what happened. But they got started too late. We're not going to be too late this time. And people may think we're out ahead of the curve, but the fact is it's better to be out ahead of this thing than behind the power curve on this. We've got to stop this now because they're interpreting it as our acquiescence and our affirmative consent. So each of the citizens who say, well, they're not coming for me right now. We need to help raise their consciousness about the constitutional rights themselves, not just their own narrow personal self-interest, but the self-interest of our country and our other citizens that need to be protected.
Yeah. You know, Sarah, you mentioned the water issue, and there are a myriad issues on the plates of us all.
Yes.
And it's an overwhelmed situation.
Yes.
So I'm wondering how you can speak to what role this plays in that pie
Yes.
of overwhelm.
Yes. We are also working on other issues at the Romero Institute, but we feel this one is central, actually. It's foundational to everything else. Because if people are concerned about the water, the drought, if they're concerned about peace issues, if they're concerned about just local and county issues,
Or environmental issues.
environmental issues, any issues, if we don't have our rights, we cannot be assured that we can work on these issues and speak freely and protest and make our voices known about what it is we disagree with and what it is we are proposing. So to us, no matter what else anybody's doing, it's important to sign the petition, perhaps bring your organization into the coalition, and become informed and be part of the citizens' initiative on the ballot, because this is foundational to everything else we're doing. And to go again to the argument that comes up, that, well, this won't apply to me because I don't do anything that could possibly attract anyone to me. I mean, we have to think about it. If we are concerned about this issue and this issue, and we know that our elected officials have to participate in solving these problems, what can happen with this kind of surveillance and this kind of intimidation tactics is we know well that our elected officials are not saints, and they may have private issues that may not be illegal but could be extremely embarrassing to them. And so when you have this blurring of our privacy protections and our rights, and someone comes up with information that they can use against that official and basically neutralize that official for being responsive to the citizens, that's how it can affect a person, even if that person has no reason to think that they would attract any federal attention. Mm-hmm. But if the violation of the rights is occurring across the board like this, it's going to affect our ability to get solutions to the problems that affect our lives, because we will not be able to engage in the political process in the way that we have been guaranteed, and we will not be able to count on any of our representatives listening to us and being able to act on the desires of the people.
And it's important to remember that the right this year that we're going to see a number of very dramatic things going on with regard to this issue of global climate change. And the major corporations are locking down on this to fight back against having mandatory and legally enforceable restrictions placed upon the global greenhouse gas emissions that they can emit. And people are mobilizing to try to compel them to do this. They'll be meeting in Paris starting on November 28th. Pope Francis is going to be issuing a papal encyclical here on the 18th of June. He's asked to speak in front of the joint Congress, a joint session of Congress, unprecedented. He's going to be speaking to the United Nations. So that there's a lot of energy ramping up right now to try to put major amounts of pressure on the governmental entities to rein in their corporations. And we know that the corporations have huge and powerful influence inside government because now of the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court, allowing them to pay as much money as they want to bribe the congressmen and senators and legislators. So that the reality is a lot of the people are saying that we need to resort to major demonstrations. For example, against the WTO, like they had up in Seattle, and there's other places where major marches take place, where they're demonstrating that the people are so upset that we're going to get in the street and march and mobilize against them like we did against the war in Vietnam. Law enforcement people and government authorities view all of that as civil disorder. And if in fact they view this as civil disorder, they're going to start using the surveillance system that they've got in place to monitor all of the plans and all of the activities and organizing and mobilizing for this and try to suppress this, because they're moving very dangerously into a concept of pre-crime. That it's not, they do not want to be confined to just punishing people for having committed a crime. What they're doing is they're trying to get out ahead of them, like they've been authorized to do for terrorism, get out ahead of any kind of violations of law by doing the surveillance and getting engaged in pre-crime, like in the Minority Report with Tom Cruise. That's what they're trying to do right now. And that's always been the dream of any authoritarian state, is to be able to have access to all the information and use it to stop anybody from doing anything that they think they have a right to not allow to happen. So that we're at a very vital point in our history of our evolution of our Constitution here. We cannot allow the federal government and state law enforcement authorities to start to move into this mindset of pre-crime and using surveillance and gathering information from every communication we have. Every time we go out in public and they can monitor our cars and monitor our faces and take photographs of us on the street and store them in these national security computers, that's what they're doing. And the Obama administration has been extraordinarily bold in asserting that gathering all of that information and storing it is not a violation of the Fourth Amendment. That they don't need to get a warrant until they actually decide they're going to start searching through it. But the Fourth Amendment prohibits the seizure, not just the searching through, but the seizure of our private information. They can't do that, right? And so that seizing of this information and storing it away like this. And the fact of the matter is, they've now hit upon this statutory scheme of setting up the FISA court, they call it, the Federal Intelligence Surveillance Court. That just what they do is they don't have a probable cause standard at all, because they're foreign intelligence. It's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And what they do is they're using this standard of a reasonably articulable suspicion that a person may have been engaged in any activity which is pertinent to the national security of the United States. That is so far removed from a Fourth Amendment standard. And for them to be authorized to gather that type of information in and use this and hand it over to normal law enforcement people is to completely erode the entire wall that the Fourth Amendment sets up to protect our privacy. And so that the people have to mobilize now, and this is a focused, careful, moderate plan on the part of our citizenry to make it clear that we're not acquiescing to this, and that we're going to take concrete steps, and that we're going to call upon our elected officials in the city of Santa Cruz and in Santa Cruz County to respond to their constitutional oath of office. Or else we'll get somebody else to fill those offices that will protect us. And these are the means by which we are going to be able to do this.
So, Sara, what makes you feel confident that this can be achieved?
Well, I think we need to really remember that citizen action has always been very effective in this country. And there was a time when we thought we would always have slavery, and it was citizen mobilization that ended that. There was a time when women couldn't vote, not very long ago, and it was citizen mobilization that made it possible for women to vote. And we just have to get together and mobilize and educate one another and focus on our goals and apply the pressure that makes it clear to elected officials, this is important to us, and if you don't do this, we will remember it in the next election.
And we'll take initiative under the ballot initiative to do it ourselves.
We have run out of time, and I just want to express my deep appreciation for your decades of service to our human family and for coming today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Joy Binah is an author. Check out her book, The 10 Most Nutritious Recipes on the Planet, and Step into Radiant Health. It's available at Amazon.com.